Hello friends, and welcome to another online video of Ms. Hoskins' AP Environmental Science. This section is on population and community ecology. Essentially, species have two different types of reproductive strategies and a distinct survivorship. So we call them K-selected and R-selected species. A K-selected species has a strategy with a low intrinsic growth rate that causes a population to increase very slowly until it reaches carrying capacity. R-selected species are species that have a very high intrinsic growth rate. Essentially, they produce a lot of offspring at one time, and that often leads to this overshoot and die-off type of thing. So the irony in that it happened to a reindeer made it very interesting to study that one incident. A classic example that you may have heard of is the relationship between snow hares and lynx. Lynxes prey on them in North America. So trapping records from the Hudson Bay indicate this type of data. And that basically shows that the lynx population peaks 1 or 2 years after the hare population had peaked. As the hare population increases, the population of more prey has increased, and so lynxes are able to hunt them more. But once they're hunted, then the population of snowshoe hares begins to decline, and so that eventually, as the hares start to experience a die-off, so does the guys that depend on them for food, the lynx. So this decline in hares leads to this subsequent decline in the lynx population, right? And because the low lynx numbers reduce the number of predation, then guess what? The population of hares also increases again. We see this example over and over again throughout nature. There's a similar one in Michigan that you may have heard of about wolves, which coexist with different sorts of like reindeer and elk and those types of species. So a wolf is a predator of a moose. And so we can predict moose and wolf declines based on this hunting and trapping sort of pattern now. However, different amongst the first two animals, K-selected species have a low intrinsic growth rate, which means it causes their population to slowly increase over time. So K-selected species that have this low growth rate can cause a population's slow increase to take several years, decades even. And as a result, its abundance can be really challenging to determine. So, in the example of a wolf and a moose with very slow growth rates, sometimes it takes scientists decades, years, a century to figure out that it is doing this oscillation. The irony in this, too, is that as the population of wolves succumbed to this virus that they experienced around the 1970s, there was this dramatic population increase in the moose that happened in this a quick amount of time. So with the introduction of this virus, when the wolf predation on the moose basically stopped, the moose population grew rapidly until it ran out of food. And then it experienced this large die-off in like the 1990s. And you can see that on the graph here, is that we now have a low moose and a low wolf population. So even though we think of population size as, that's usually monitored through reproductive efforts, you can see external factors can also influence these types of situations. So this table summarizes the traits of a K-selected and an R-selected species. So these two categories represent opposite ends of a wide spectrum of reproductive strategies. Most species fall somewhere in between these two extreme examples, and many of them exhibit combinations of traits from one or both extremes. Like tuna, for example, or redwood trees. They are both very, very long-lived species, but they have, and they take a very long time to reach reproductive maturity. But once they do, they produce millions and millions and millions of offspring at one time with no parental care. In addition to these different reproductive strategies, species can also have very distinct patterns of survival, which can span just to a single individual. And when we plot some of these patterns on a graph, we get what we call survivorship curves. Survivorship curves are graphical representations that are distinct patterns to a species survival that function basically of age. And we call those type 1, type 2, and type 3. These survivorship curves come along with very distinct patterns of survival over the lifespan of individuals. So a type 1 survivorship curve has the highest survival throughout most of the lifespan. But when an individual starts to die in large numbers as they approach old age, then the species of type 1 curve we include in the case-selective species. So these are things like elephants and whales and even humans. So in contrast, a type 2 survivorship curve has a relatively constant decline in survivorship throughout the species' lifespan. So a species with a type 2 curve, those include things that can grow quickly, but they don't necessarily all wait until they're like 85 to die. They're dying throughout their whole lifetime. Squirrels come to mind, corals, that type of thing. Corals are there's birth and then there's growth, and growth occurs at a constant level, and so does death. So type 3 survivorship curves, they have a very low survivorship overall. Even early in life, very few individuals reach adulthood. And species that have a type 3 curve are what we call R-selected species. And these are things that high reproductive, very high death. Like mosquitoes are a good example. Dandelions, types of flowering plants, those types of things. Type 3. So different species have distinct patterns of survivorship over their own lifespan. And it ranges from exhibiting like excellent survivorship, like up until old age, a type 1, to exhibiting a relatively constant decline in survivorship, what we call a type 2, or the squirrel example, to having a very, very low rate of survivorship, what we call type 3 curve, as seen in the dandelion. As a scientist, you just really wish it was as simple as taking one species and plotting it on a curve. But interconnected populations, and most things are interconnected, form what we call these metapopulations. Cougars, which we also call pumas or mountain lions, once lived throughout North America, but because of habitat destruction and overhunting, they have found new territory in the remote mountain range of western United States. And in New Mexico, cougar populations are distributed in patches of mountainous habitat that's scattered over this desert landscape. So this mountain habitat where the cats live allows them to avoid human activity and provides them some sort of reliable source of water and prey, because they like deer. But because areas of desert basically separate the cougars' mountains habitats from other populations, we can consider the cougars of these mountain ranges to be each distinct populations. And each population has its own dynamics based on abiotic conditions and prey availability. So large mountain ranges that support these cougar populations and even the smaller mountain ranges have what we would call corridors. And these are basically strips of natural habitat that can actually connect them. They provide some sort of connectedness amongst the species. And a group of spatially distinct populations that are connected, occasional movements happen between them, and that's when they get the term metapopulation. So in the metapopulation behavior, some of these cougars are interconnected with the other groups and will move in between these mountain ranges. They'll venture through the desert to get to the other one. And when that happens, interbreeding occurs. And that's when individuals with a similar genotype, because of course they're all big cats, they're all cougars, they're usually some sort of really close relative, they breed with each other and they produce offspring that have some impaired ability to survive and reproduce. So here's an example of our metapopulation of cougars. So this connectedness amongst the population in this metapopulation is an important part of how the overall population of these cats exists. Even though small populations are more likely to go extinct than actual larger ones, we've actually seen
Mommy,
that small populations...
Me and Lincoln want Wendy's chicken.
Wendy's chicken. Got it. Okay.
Me and Lincoln.
I've lost my train of thought here. All right, so small populations are more likely than larger ones to go extinct, right? And we've seen like small populations, and certainly they have low genetic variation, like the cheetahs, and therefore they may not be able to adapt and change to environmental conditions. So these small populations can also experience an interbreeding depression. And this interbreeding depression occurs when the individuals with smaller genotypes, they have less DNA variability to pull from, they typically have relatives or cousins, they breed with each other and produce offspring that have impaired abilities to survive and reproduce. And the impaired abilities occur when each parent carries a copy of some sort of like harmful mutation that's present in like that species' overall genome. And when their parents interbreed, some of their offsprings, they receive those 2 copies of that harmful mutation, and as a result, they have a poor chance to survive and be successful. So small populations are more vulnerable than larger ones, and they're more vulnerable to like catastrophic events like harsh winters, or they don't often survive critically low numbers. So this whole metapopulation idea, where they experience immigrants essentially from nearby populations, is actually key to how these cougars maintain some sort of genetic diversity, and it basically helps them from going extinct. So, using the cougars as an example, I'm often asked as a biology teacher in the past, why are we not allowed to marry our brother or sisters or our cousins? And that is because that essentially when we interbreed, we increase the homozygosity of our recessive genes. So what that means is that instead of having dominant or dominant recessive, a lot of heterozygous or homozygous dominant genes, when we interbreed in our own within our own realm of people or mountain lions in this case, who have similar DNA structure that we do, we increase the rate of homozygous recessivity. And that's not in your textbook, but I'm just telling you that those genes, recessive genes, even though they're not all fatal, they do have low stability. And that's why interbreeding is illegal and bad, is because it will show and demonstrate a lot of our genetic mutations and flaws that we carry. And it does that to the cougars too. It's not always like malformed body parts or anything. A lot of times it's just immune system destructivity, where they don't produce a lot of the immune system cells that they need by interbreeding too much. But it's not all bad. I mean, because many habitats are naturally patchy just across landscape in general for many species, a metapopulation is existence for that it is natural for many of them. Numerous species of butterflies, I know, for example, they specialize in living on certain types of plants. And so that gives them this patchy distribution. And even some amphibians live in very isolated wetlands, but occasionally they'll disperse across other wetlands to breed. And so the number of species that exist in a metapopulation can grow, and it's important to them because it's how some of them have survived human activities. By having these little fragmented habitats where they can cross and interbreed, they basically increase their population size to something that is larger, and that way they have a better chance of survival. And this managing of this metapopulation increases their vitality and basically protects our Earth's biodiversity.